truly is a land of confusion. Today on The Big Shoe with Kirk Kelly, 30 minutes of me is definitely enough. And this show will certainly demonstrate that. We're going to talk about the United States Constitution. Those documents, they're what gets everybody in trouble and what gets everybody out of trouble. Okay, 10 Bill of Rights within them. We're going to talk about who wrote them, where they came from, the beliefs in them, and the Founding Fathers spreading the word of a revolution. And why, exactly why, did we need to have a revolution? Because if you look at what King George charged the colonies in taxes at the time the Declaration of Independence was signed, they paid less taxes than we do as American citizens today in the United States of America. So why would we need to have a revolution? Things weren't all that bad. The only problems were that in these colonies that were built by slaves, if we go back to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, one of the top northern 5 colonies of the original 13 colonies in North America, we go back to about 1773. Everything was built for 100 years by slaves. Truly were. And if you were in the colonies, you probably had to have connections with somebody who was wealthy who came over here and made a stake and offered you work. Or you were here to move westerly and stake your claim and live off the land in a free and roaming area. The only problem that you had with being able to go anywhere was this evil thing called Indians. Did you hear me? Indians. They have a great deal to do with the United States Constitution, if you truly look at it. Because without fighting off the Indians, they could not expand. And in fact, prior to the British starting to fight the Indians in Jamestown, Virginia, the very first colony that we can actually prove, they were almost down to nothing until King George sent troops to fight back the Cherokee Indian. Now, this evolved into where the French were able to converse and do trade with the Cherokee Indian, and they promised them a bunch of things that white man started to promise Indians then and reneged on the whole situation. But you have to understand the Cherokees had already dealt with Americans on the Atlantic coast for hundreds of years. Well, 150, we'll say. They've been burned before because these people were in the settlement. They could not make it. They were dying of disease and hunger and starvation. And the Cherokee were letting them because they were not any benefit to them. And they knew that they were not going to make it if they didn't help them. But the French were able to deal with them. And they basically learned how to speak to them, communicate, and it began the Indian-French Wars. Okay, the French-Indian Wars were fought against the English, and the English spent a great deal of money on those wars to provide space for future settlements. Okay, so it is at this point in time in 1773, most of these men who lived over there were in the war. A lot of them men were sent here from France and from Britain, and when the wars ended, they were settled here. They didn't get picked back up and taken home. So for many generations, they had been raised and born to 1773. But without the British control and power and the elimination of the Cherokee settlements and the deprivation of what that was doing to expansion, these colonies would not be in existence. There would not be Philadelphia because the Indians would still own it. This war cost a lot of money to King George, a lot to the British Parliament. They were a military might like the world has never seen if you equate the time and the size of their military compared to what we have today and the technology advancement, of course. They were huge. That's what they did. They were on every seaboard that was known to man in the oceans. They sailed the seven seas, and they commanded them. But he spent a great deal on this war to eliminate the Indians, and most all the settlers there came from England that had a lot of money. And instead of ruining this perfect thing that they had going and making tons of money and expanding, any limitation and taxation by the king was not acceptable. They were literally starting a conspiracy to not pay back Britain for policing and providing settlement space by defeating the Indian and providing them expansion. It leads to deception. And these guys didn't want to pay the king back. So they took advantage of some things that the king did. And they found the only line in the Constitution in Britain that they could use for a revolution. Because the men who were the founding fathers were the richest men in the United States with the biggest ties to royal blood. You are who you hang out with. That's all there is to it. Wealthy men that are successful in business do not hang out with the beer drinkers at the bar. If they do, then they probably have alcoholism. But that's not generally where somebody successful in your community goes to hang out. That's not where they're going. They're going to a place where other people have ideas on how to make money. That's how successful people make it in the business arena. It works today if you try it. Take a look at who wrote the U.S. Constitution. Well, the biggest names are, of course, Thomas Paine, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. Okay, but the biggest name you need to understand is Thomas Paine, because it says it on his headstone in New York. Without the pen of Thomas Paine, the George Washington's sword would have yielded in vain. Okay? It's telling you right there, he was the main idea. Now, where did Thomas Paine come from? Thomas Paine came from Freemasonry because he was in the same lodge as Ben Franklin. And that's where these guys in Freemasonry and why they meet in secret societies. It is not to do devil worship. Well, the way they handle your money, it could be figured that. But that's not what Freemasonry is about. It's about intertwined, doing good within the community and working together to do it right. So what better place than to find guys who can spread the word of a revolution within a community than people that are upstanding citizens found in Freemasonry? So that's where Thomas Paine was found, in England. Now, Ben Franklin, if you look at him, was not your sweet angel Christian believer by any means. And in fact, stories tell you that in 97 they found bodies under his house, okay? Because he was very scientific and studied some things that are way out there for the time. But he was a very clever man. And he grabbed onto Thomas Paine and brought him back to America to establish the first movements of a revolution. Because those rich guys, the founding fathers and so forth, their lawyers and others, did not want to get caught up in being responsible for paying Britain anything and interfering with the way they were running things, being successful. So they got Thomas Paine to start a newspaper which was published by Ben Franklin, and it was called Common Purpose. If you look at the symbolry that was on common purpose, many of these conspiracy theorists say that that is the Illuminati symbolisms, the group that is supposedly responsible for all the conspiracies that happen today and in the past. But that is not the truth. If you have studied commercial art, such as I have, you'll understand that the symbol of the all-seeing eye, which is found on your dollar bill, has been a sign since the Egyptian times, 5,500 years ago. And it is a script meaning to illuminate. That is it. It is the future. It is a sign of the future, to open your eyes. And that's where the symbols all came from. So it can blow some of the conspiracies, but we'll talk about the Illuminati in another program. But Thomas Paine wrote this newspaper, and it spread all kinds of mischievous propaganda about the British Parliament and what they were going to do to the United States colonies. They were going to tax it to death. And King George and the Parliament agreed that they needed to tax for postal service. So they got a stamp tax, and then a tea tax, and it just started adding it on, and it just only egged fire to these rich guys maneuvering to get the king out of here. We don't want to pay back this debt. So they spread it throughout the colony that King George was going to take your property unless you paid for it, unless you came clean and didn't have any money financed. They would just take it away from you. This was spread throughout the entire colonies, and they were so afraid of taxation. But they did not even understand that it was propaganda by the rich, the ones who controlled the country, that would write all their legislature. The United States Constitution is not even at the time new, original, unique, or not been established by another government prior in history. But not very many colonists are very educated. Not a lot of people that are doing grunt work, helping the rich maneuver their way over here and run the United States because they're rich and have the money to do so. Colonies. Basically, your founding fathers took advantage of a lot of people that were not very educated. They didn't understand about prior history. What other countries? Not many of them understood about Rome or the Roman Empire. They didn't understand what other cultures were before them. They were trying to move to a new settlement, a new world, and establish freedom. Not being taxed, not anything. So these rich guys could get this infiltrated, this idea with the state representatives, which are also Freemasons, men that stand in the top of the communities down in the South. And they got them all to unite. And now Thomas Paine wrote a book after he established the Constitution and the writings of the Declaration of Independence, which he and Thomas Jefferson developed. But he wrote a book called The Age of Reason. And Thomas Paine was in no way a Christian. He died on his bed as a deist with witnesses that claim he never claimed repentance for the Christian beliefs in the Bible. Now, if we look at the other founding fathers, none of the ones that we speak of, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, none of them were Christians. There are the 10 Bill of Rights, and there are the 10 Commandments. Do not get them mixed up. That is not what the founding fathers put on this earth in North America in 1776. Their ideas were exactly the opposite of the way I was taught in public schools growing up. I was taught that we live in a divine country, and it was spread throughout that we trust in God, and we are Christians, and we are set up with a divine plan of government that was divinely given to us. That is basically the picture was planted in my head. Truly nothing ticks me off more than this. Because at the age of about 23, I really understood the truths and the facts of the guys that wrote the Constitution. If you're not already checking your child's homework, trying to figure out what the public school is trying to teach your child about the history of the United States of America and how it works, you're not paying attention. It is why I pulled my kids out of the public school system and put them in a private school system, because I wanted the truth taught to my children. I want them to know everything that this country has done in her history. And it's not out of disrespect for veterans who have fought for the freedoms of this country. That is not my purpose. My purpose is to get you to understand how this country evolved into the problems and the chaos that it's in today. And my biggest thing that I'm working on is trying to accumulate enough of a solution to provide it to you as a listener that it might help you every day. Try to live in a world that today, if you don't have a lawyer, you can't make it through everyday average life living in the United States of America. You will need a lawyer before your life ends on this earth. And why do you need a lawyer? Because the United States Constitution was written by those that understood the law and were the early lawyers in the colonies who wrote the 10 Bill of Rights. They are not divine. They basically give you what a man who wants to make something of himself needs to have as rights to move along to gain dignity in his survival. Your 10 Bill of Rights are not a new idea, and they weren't to the founding fathers. They were ideas compromised from various ideas from the past, mostly influenced by the democracies of Greece, with philosophies of Socrates, his student Plato, and his student Aristotle. In fact, most of the Bill of Rights are based on philosophies that were modernized for weaponry at the time, off of Aristotle's beliefs of dignity in a human man. That is where the ideas come from. But they were also influenced from other places, such as Adam Weishaupt from the Illuminati. Those were the representative ideas in the Constitution that lead to the rich being successful and having the American dream. Those Bill of Rights are not granted to the poor man. When they granted them that all men are created equal, slavery did not end for at least 100 years. So when we take a deeper look into those founding fathers that wrote the Constitution, that so many people, believers, divine believers in the theories of Christianity being involved with the foundings of this country, they are way off balance. And I can prove this certainly by providing more evidence and documentation that what I'm talking about proves that the Constitution was not written for Christians by Christians. Far more than you can provide me evidence that it was. By a ton. There is no jury in the United States that would find my side wrong in a court of law. The evidence is overwhelming that we are set up for a capitalistic society where the rich have maneuvers using lawyers who have written 10 Bill of Rights into 5,000 books in the Library of Congress explaining your 10 Bill of Rights in the Constitution. You had 10 Bill of Rights that have been amended 27 times. The United States government did not ever, in any of those 27 times, grant you rights. they took them away. All it takes is money to make that person do what you want them to do, depending on how morally fabricated this person is and how educated they are. When we look at deceptions and we try to investigate conspiracy theory, you must know motive. And motive is the difference in an investigation. It is the most important thing to understand who benefited from the crime, who was there at the crime, and why was the crime committed is usually explained right there in motive. That is why private detectives, investigators, FBI agents look for motive in a capital crime. It usually gets them close to their suspect. When we look at the United States Constitution and we look at all the things that have evolved to today, it is absolutely evident that the Constitution has the perfect plan for the rich man to get the American dream. Who were the two sides of the revolution? It was England and it was the colonies. Now, if I want to look at documentation that provides the entire foundation of a great country that I was born into, I want to see who the people were that were involved in this documentation that was the founding of it, and who were the sides in it, and what part did they play, and what conditions happened on those two parties that were involved, or those parties suspected to be in that. So I would have to look at the American Revolution from the perspective of the English as well, not just from the perspective of those that were brought up here in the United States of America, who have been taught that this is a divine country and that we absolutely had to break away from a tyrant king. If you go to England and you study the American Revolution, 60% of the people in England believe that the United States is still British, that they own 50 British colonies, because there is no documentation in history ever found, ever proposed, ever brought into the spectrum of the Constitution and the American Revolution, which is signed by the leader, the Prime Minister, or the King or Queen of England, and the top representative of the United States, that would state that the United States is now recognized by England as its own unified state. Never. If you are going to start a revolution against the largest and most powerful military might on the face of the planet, you are going to have to build a military. You cannot win fights between governments unless you have people that are willing to risk life and limb. So you were given the 10 Bill of Rights in the Constitution, but you are not given the true reasoning for why you are fighting the revolution. It is total deception. But if you can do it and get the people to believe and fear this tyrant king who is going to tax you to death if we continue on with this way of government and British rule, you have got to make it look like these are reasoning for one, to protect his survival and the conditions of that survival, but you need to do it with a thing called courage. Men follow courage. They do not follow leaders or ideas. They will follow ideas that are supported with a courageous movement, which, if successful, will be the greatest defeat. It will go down in history as the greatest victory, and it would certainly demonstrate a divine approach to government. Listen, during the Revolution, when it was first announced the colonies were going to go to war with Britain, the rest of the world heard about this and freaked out. They could not believe that the colonies would actually try to stir a war with the British, because the British, were ruthless. They were so dominant on all the battlefields for 100 years and were growing technologically, industrialized, and building a military might that was inconceivable to today's understanding of it. The only governmental force, the only nation that was even close to having the military powers that the British had, were the French. The British had already defeated the Spanish all over the Western Hemisphere. They were wiping the Spanish out from all of the settlements, taking them over one by one, because they had such huge naval forces. And the French took about 9 months before they ever sent any troops here, because their first maneuvering was that if they could get the colonies to fight the British and use up their armies, that at one point in time they could come back and possibly finish the British off here. That was their biggest rule. So they hesitated in bringing troops because they thoroughly believed that the British were going to win the war against the colonies, but would be weak enough where the French could attack them. So they hesitated because this was a war. This American Revolution was not a war that the British could afford. Listen, King George had been tapped out. The French-American Indian Wars had tapped him out. They were in huge debt. And along with the wars on the trade routes of Africa were expensive. It cost a lot of money to establish the trade routes for slaves. The British government did not just go down to Africa and the slaves just said, "Here, put me to work for free." They had to fight them into submission to understand that if they did not perform labor for free, they would be killed. And the British were broke. There is no part in history that tells me that the British sent the Northern Army to fight the colonies. They could not afford it. Look at where you are today. Is this the American dream? Is this what you were taught that you could have when you were a child? Certainly not. It's much more the American deception. You are not living in a direct democracy. You will not find that phrase in the history books taught in the public schools in the United States. No history book talks about a direct democracy. It only says that the United States was founded on the ideas of a democracy, a federation known as a democracy that was only practiced in Rome and Greece in ancient history. A direct democracy is where the people that are the civilians of a nation all decide by vote, the majority vote on policy and legislation. They do not have representatives. Sound good? There's a reason for that. The Constitution of the United States of America was not written by peasants. It was written by the elite rich, who were representing the elite rich that were richer than them. And if you trace back all the presidents of the United States, all of them have a bloodline related to George Washington. And George Washington is related to the English royal family. And the royal families of England came from Judean cultures. I'm Kirk Kelly. 30 minutes of me, it's enough.